Democrats as we welcome the 3 candidates for Secretary of State on the Democratic ticket. We have with us Shemia Fagan, Mark Hass, and Jamie McLeod-Skinner. Shemia Fagan grew up in rural Oregon, getting her education through Oregon Public Schools. She has a law degree from Lewis and Clark Law School. A civil rights attorney, Fagan served on the David Douglas School Board prior to her election to the Oregon House. She currently serves in the Oregon Senate, where she has worked on many issues, including a lot of workforce paid leave issues. Mark Hass has a BS from the University of Oregon and an MA from American University in Washington, D.C. His background is in broadcast journalism, and he is also a business manager. He was elected to the Oregon House in 2000 and served until 2007 when he went to the Oregon Senate. Hass serves on the National College Promise Advisory Board, the Northwest Health Foundation, and the Beaverton Library Foundation Board. He has worked especially on education and state revenue and finance issues in his years in Salem. Jamie McLeod-Skinner spent early years in Africa, where her mother was a teacher. A graduate of Ashland High School and Cornell University, she worked for the International Rescue Committee in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Kosovo. That resulted in work in San Jose, California, transferring skills that she had been educated for to work with water systems. She served on the Santa Clara City Council for 8 years, serving on the audit committee. She then returned to her roots in Oregon and went to the University of Oregon. She currently serves on the Jefferson County Educational Services District Board and is then on the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. She was the 2018 candidate for the 2nd Congressional District race. Shemia, would you like to add something to that?
Yes, thank you, Marcia, and thank you, Marion County Democrats. As Marcia mentioned in my intro, I grew up in rural Oregon. I'm a proud graduate of the Dallas High School, and I grew up my early years in Dufur, about 600 people. And so I know what it feels like for Oregonians who feel like the centers of power are far away from them. And that's why in my service as a legislator and also as a civil rights attorney, my goal has been to break down barriers for Oregonians, to make sure that Oregonians aren't intimidated and don't feel like their halls of power are far away from them, be that a kid in Dufur or somebody living in downtown Portland or a mom out in Grants Pass. We need to make sure that all Oregonians know that their government is here for them. And that's why I've led on issues expanding access to voting and expanding access to small business support since I joined the legislature in 2013, chief sponsoring the bill to create a small business advocate within the Secretary of State's office, being one of the leaders to pass automatic voter registration here in Oregon, and most recently co-sponsoring the bill to get dark money, to expose dark money in our politics, as well as to have prepaid postage and to join the National Popular Vote Compact. So I've been leading on these issues for nearly a decade as I've served in the Oregon legislature, and I'm really excited to continue to lead on these as Oregon's next Secretary of State.
Mark?
Thank you, Marcia. Hello, Marion County Ds. We're going through some very difficult times right now, times that focus a spotlight on leaders. You may have been thinking this yourself. Are they moving fast enough? Are they decisive? Do they know what they're doing? It's one thing to lead when the economy is booming and everything is going great. It's another thing to lead in tough times when things are terrible, like they are now. I've been tested in these tough times in the recession of 2002 and again in the Great Recession of 2008. Both times, Oregon has come back, but both times there were painful decisions to make about budget cuts, about getting people back to work, all while keeping state government running, universities, prisons, hospitals. I responded through these tough times with passage of 2 rainy day funds, which will help a lot, which will really help Oregon a lot in the next couple of years, but also with the passage of a minimum wage increase, paid sick leave, and the Oregon Promise, which provides free community college for Oregon high school graduates. In the coming years, we'll need to get Oregon moving again. We'll need to get Oregon back to work. You've heard this phrase of wartime generals and peacetime generals. I have that battlefield experience during wars. And right now, Oregon does need people with experience, know-how, trust, and independence.
Hi, thanks for hosting this forum. As a kid, I watched my mom work hard, but sometimes not eat dinner because we didn't have enough food in the house. I went to school with refugee kids. And in the late 80s, when I came out of the closet, my community was shunned by mainstream politics. That's why making sure all voices are heard is so important to me. And there are Oregonians, rural and urban areas across our state who are not feeling heard right now, not feeling heard in the halls of power. I built my public school education in Southern Oregon, but used the privilege of my education not to go take the corporate route, but to serve others. I managed the repairs of schools and hospitals in post-war Bosnia and Kosovo, so actually had that actual wartime experience. Managed refugee resettlement, helped people become citizens and vote, fought climate change, and helped make government more effective and efficient through audits and organizational effectiveness. I served, I've been with regard to government, frontline staff management, and 8 years of elected office in urban and rural areas. Now I'm a natural resource attorney, an elected member of the Jefferson County ESD. It's the Secretary of State's job to make sure that democracy works, to protect democracy, assure accountable government, and safeguard our natural resources. It's essentially an executive management position with this oversight over several divisions and over 200 staff and employees. Also the backstop for redistricting and lieutenant governor. It's important that the Secretary of State understands how government actually works, not just how laws are made. The policy part is important as a backstop, but you've got to understand how government works to be effective and make it more accountable. And I'm the only one with that experience and executive leadership experience in government and in nonprofits. Manage audits, have a track record of developing and implementing policies that effectively impact our climate. We need a bridge builder in this role to move beyond the toxic culture that we have in the Capitol right now. I have the breadth and depth of experience for this role, and this time now calls for a different kind of leadership.
Thank you. Let's go to our first question, and Shemia will answer first, then followed by Mark, then Jamie, and then we'll start the rotation. What do you think the Office of the Secretary of State can do to work to keep dark money out of our elections?
Well, the Secretary of State can first off implement House Bill 2983, and I'm the only person running who actually was a sponsor of that bill. Dark money is these nonprofits or who try to pretend that they're not actually being political, and so they come and they spend a ton of money just trashing one candidate as opposed to promoting another, and then they say they're not political, so they don't have to disclose their donors. In the 2019 session, I helped champion House Bill 2983 to essentially expose those dark money donors. Now, beyond dark money donors, which is just exposing those nonprofits or C4s who were actually out spending in campaigns, we need to actually get big money out of our politics. And that's why I was also happy to help champion a constitutional amendment that will go to Oregon voters this November. Please vote yes on the constitutional amendment to allow us to actually limit campaign contributions in Oregon to make sure that we continue to wrest political power in Oregon with the people and not with large corporations and wealthy donors.
Thank you. Mark?
Thank you. I was a strong supporter of the dark money law that passed the legislature last year. And I know people are just frustrated and exasperated when they see ads come on that are usually negative and they don't know who's sponsoring those ads. This will end with this new law. And part and parcel with that, I was the chief sponsor of this bill that all voters will see in November to change our Constitution so we can once and for all set campaign finance limits. And that'll change for the better dark money, money of all kinds, and limited so that regular people have a shot in our elections process. I hope that measure passes. I ask everyone to pass it and find 10 friends to vote for it as well. And then next year we can get about the businesses of actually going down to the nitty gritty and setting campaign finance limits at state and local governments.
Thank you. Jamie?
Campaign finance reform is so important. And of course, we need to pass the ballot measure to make the change to the Constitution to allow it. But where the legislature really failed was in not having companion legislation that also actually set limits. So the can's been kicked down the road on this one, and that's incredibly disappointing to so many Oregonians. I'm actually the only one in this race who has never taken corporate PAC money, I've signed a pledge long ago not to take fossil fuel, not to take opioid money. Given the dramatic impact the opioid crisis has had on our state, we're the second hardest hit state in the nation, it is stunning to me that it's commonplace for legislators to take money from opioid manufacturers. I never have in my 9 years of elected office experience in my 4 races, never have and I never will. I have both not complied when there are established limits, as there were in my congressional race in 2018, but in my prior races in 2004 and 2008, I voluntarily opted into campaign finance limits. Even for this race, early on in the process, I proposed that we establish self-imposed for just the primary for Democrats because it's such a critical issue and wanted to be able to show that we can actually do this. So of course, once legislation is established, then rigorous enforcement of that legislation is something the Secretary of State can do. And then also, as issues come up, the enforcement mechanism right now is not very strong. So and there's complaints that the media has brought on this, that right now the process is someone else has to complain. If my office knows about it, we will pursue and follow up. And if someone gives an unsatisfactory answer, we will pursue to make sure we are enforcing current laws to help protect all Oregonians. Our voices are going to be drowned out if money drowns them out. And that commitment, that longstanding commitment that I have to not taking money that influences and corporate PAC money is a distinction that in this race.
We can't hear you, Marcia.
It didn't work when I clicked. Sorry about that. Let's go to the second question. Mark starts this time. What role should the Secretary of State play in an emergency pandemic situation?
Well, we're going to be in a COVID era for the rest of this year and in a COVID recovery era for many years to come, maybe 5 years, just like we were in 2008, 2009. It took that long recovery was at least 4 or 5 years out before we started to dig ourselves out of it. There will be special commissions. There will be a joint legislative committee next year to look at this. And I think for the Secretary of State, the obvious step is to audit Oregon's response, emergency services, the Oregon Health Authority, corrections, for sure, the employment division. And I think we owe it to the families in this state who have lost loved ones or family members to this virus. And the questions that I want asked and to be the subject of audits is really what went wrong? Why weren't we as prepared as we should have been? Why was it so hard to get facts? That is a big issue here that seems to have held things up. And not from state government. Why was it so hard to get facts from long-term nursing facilities, from hospitals, from the governor's office? And I don't want to point fingers here. We are in uncharted waters, and I don't want to second guess anyone. And I don't believe there's anything nefarious. I just think that we need these answers to be prepared and better prepared for the next emergency that comes up, the next crisis that comes up. Maybe it will be an earthquake, maybe it's floods, maybe it's another pandemic, maybe it's a terrorist strike. But we need to ask these hard questions of our own government and look at what worked. And a lot of things did work, and look at what didn't work so that we're in better shape for the next crisis that comes down the road.
Jamie.
Great, thank you. So I'm the only one in this race who's actually had experience in emergency type situations, in crisis situations, and when I worked in post-war Bosnia and Kosovo. It was right after the Dayton Accords had been signed, and we were working with military and interacting on a regular basis. And then also when I worked in local government in the Bay Area, it's both training in the NIM system and drilled in the NIM system as staff and also as an elected official. So the way you respond to crisis is what you do at the time that it's ongoing and what you do afterwards. Now in the ongoing time and we're addressing COVID-19, it's all about partnerships and working together. This is not a time to point fingers because people's lives and their safety and our economy are at stake. So working together in partnership, making sure people have access to information is a critical role. And then also asking how you can help out. If we had the NIM system in place, the National Incident Management System, which would be one of my recommendations afterwards, that we develop that training for all government staff and people know how to kick into that system, we'd be better aligned to be able to, people have roles to react to it. But afterwards, of course, we're going to have to audit the process, look back, see what we did well, and what we could learn and do better next time. Again, I think the instituting of the NIM system be good. We know the Cascadia event. It's not a matter of if, but when. So we need to be prepared for that, or any other crisis or pandemic or anything along those lines. The other thing is what we're doing now. So yes, we're all running for office, but on my website, jamieForOregon.com, COVID-19 link site where we're providing access to information. We're also pushing information out on social media and also through our town halls. We're not just promoting other candidates, but also helping people get access to information. So Dr. Phillips, Trevor, I interviewed him earlier this month, and he talked about the health and safety issues. It was also nice to help to promote his campaign, but it's getting information out to Oregonians. That's critically important in the now, and then later we can sit back and do the Monday morning quarterbacking.
Shemia.
So I agree with my good colleagues about needing to do an emergency response and a disaster response audit. And this is a place where we really have to rely on community-based organizations when we do our audit. In our campaign, we've talked to not just the folks that are looking at the issues that affect the many, like schools being shut down, and interviewing teachers down in Eugene about homeschool tips for parents like me who are suddenly home with little kids. We've also made sure to bring the underserved voices to the table, and making sure that folks like Pacoon. We had an interview with the executive director of the Latinx and Working Families Farm Workers Union to make sure that what are the specific concerns right now for the Latinx community, for undocumented folks, and for families. And then also with Mike Marshall, who runs is executive director of a program called Oregon Recovers. This is a time when it's really, really hard for folks who are in recovery. My mom battled meth and heroin addiction for most of my life, so it's something that I know very deeply and personally what it's like to be have someone in your family who's in recovery. And so we need to make sure that when we do that audit, we're not just looking at the big systems, but we're actually starting at the community-based level to ask folks how this worked for them, renters, small businesses who are renting their commercial properties. But that's in the future. That's in the audit in 2021. Right now, our Secretary of State could be doing things like making sure that our ballots that are postmarked by Election Day are received. I've been working with the Secretary of State's office trying to push them under kind of an arcane, little known statute that would allow her to actually adjust the Election Day to no avail so far. But that is something the Secretary of State could be doing to make sure that in a crisis like this, we don't have a bunch of people crowding around in the metro areas, crowding around ballot drop boxes those last couple of days and dropping off their ballots once it's too late to mail them. And so we need to make sure also that in county clerk's offices where they're actually counting these ballots, that they're allowed to take more time, and we may have to move past move up the certification of election deadlines so that folks actually have time to safely count ballots and be far enough apart in those county clerk's offices to make sure they can do so safely. So those are all issues that we're looking at for the now, but also I agree with my good colleagues that we need a comprehensive emergency response and disaster response audit to see what we did well, where did we show cracks, and what can we do better for the next pandemic or the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake or any other disaster that would hit Oregon families.
So the next question.
You just muted yourself, Marcia.
Marcia, I can't hear you.
Your button's a little hot, I think.
It is very, very sensitive. Sorry about that. I will try to do better. We start with Jamie. What is your stance on same-day registration? Is that even possible with mail-in voting?
Absolutely. Our neighboring states have gone to it, and we're behind. What we've had is a failure of leadership in the legislature to move forward on same-day registration. I mean, that's kind of the distinction that we're seeing right now. There's a lot of talk about things that need to pass through the legislature, but we're not seeing that leadership. We're not having folks step up who are in those roles now, who can push to make those things happen. That's something that Oregon should have done long ago to make sure that it's not just giving people access on the same day, but also we know that more younger people turn out and vote if there's access to same day registration. There are other things as well that we should be moving forward on. Having postmarks count instead of requiring your ballot to be received by Election Day. Again, our neighboring states have gone to that. We should have gone forward on that already. We shouldn't have to rely on arcane parts of the statute. That's the leadership that we have in Salem, and those things should have been passed. There are a lot of other things, dropping the voting age is something we should be doing as well. There are a lot of other things that should be done in the legislature. As Secretary of State, I would champion those things. But ultimately, those things have to come out the legislature. Obviously, dropping the voting age would be a constitutional change as well, but the legislature can put that on the ballot. So the distinction between what the Secretary of State does as a champion and also what is work that's not being done in the legislature is a key issue here. And I greatly appreciate my colleagues speaking out on these issues. You're going to hear a lot of consensus on this, but the bottom line is we need leadership in the legislature to actually pass these laws.
In my next, the question was, do I support same-day voter registration, and is it possible? Absolutely and absolutely. Anytime you turn in a ballot in Oregon, even a mail-in ballot, you have to sign that ballot envelope. That's the signature that the county clerks and the volunteers actually verify to make sure that it's your ballot. There's no reason why somebody who wanted to change their registration after what is our current voter registration deadline, after ballots have arrived, they could go down, they could still turn in a ballot, change their registration, get a new ballot, and then obviously follow that same signature verification process. So absolutely we should do that. And that actually is a helpful end run around our problem, the fact that we have over 40% of voters are not affiliated with the Democratic or Republican Party, and yet we need to make sure that they have a voice in our process as well, given that by the time we get to the general election, it's primarily a Democrat versus a Republican. In recent years, sometimes an independent party candidate, sometimes that's the same person as one of the Democrats or Republicans. So we need to be doing what I've been doing my whole career in the legislature, and which is, you know, prioritizing, building coalitions, and then actually passing legislation. It's easy to criticize if you haven't been in the legislature. It's kind of like the Teddy Roosevelt poem, you know, it's not the critic who counts, it's the person who's actually been in the arena. And while Mark and I have disagreed on a lot, we've both been in the arena, marred with blood and sweat and tears, as the Teddy Roosevelt poem talks about. So I know it's easy to criticize if you've been outside the legislature, but we've done massive things just in the past 7 years. Automatic voter registration, first in the nation, pre-registering of 16-year-old voters, postmarked, paid postage, and joining the National Popular Vote Compact. So we will continue to lead on these issues, and I will continue to lead on them as Secretary of State, but I do believe that we need to go to same-day voter registration, and that is something that we should absolutely champion and pass.
Mark.
Yes, I agree that 21 days for a cutoff is just too long now, and a lot of working people get caught up into the place where they're just starting to pay attention to an election only to find out it's too late for them to register. But going to same-day registration is a relatively new phenomenon by other states who have passed it, and that's largely because of technology. The reason Oregon has a 3-week cutoff was because that's how long it took documents to be processed and go through the mail and whatnot. And now, as anyone who has ever bought anything on Amazon knows, that you can do this verification process instantaneously. So we should do that, but it is not the legislature. It's up to Oregon voters. It's a constitutional change that we need to do. And we should do that. As Secretary of State, I will help champion that effort. And it's just one of 4 or 5 things that we should do to get more voters more involved in Oregon's process. I agree that we should open up our primaries to that 41% who are not registered as Democrats or Republicans. Those are voters, those are taxpayers. They shouldn't be cut out of our process. And there's a way to allow Democrats to open up their process to unaffiliated voters only in a way that I think helps Democrats. They did this in Colorado, and when I talk to legislators there, they say, you know, we were worried, we were nervous, but what happens is many of these voters will vote for the Democratic candidate in the primary and then also in the general too. So it actually worked out better for us. So I think that open primaries and same-day voter registration will be akin to our vote by mail. It just helps more voters participate. And when more voters are participating, government works better.
Okay. So we're back to Shemia for the first question answer. There is a growing concern that civics education is largely missing in our school curriculum. As the office that is charged with running elections and putting together the state voter pamphlet, what role does the Secretary of State's office have in providing civic education and engagement with young Oregonians?
Has a huge role. In fact, to that, I would add in the Secretary of State's executive team, there is the Director of Civic Education. And it's a huge role. In fact, I've been saying this since the beginning of the campaign, that our security threats to our elections is actually misinformation. But then Steve Trout, the elections officer, said the same thing in a briefing that we had with him a week or so ago, that misinformation is actually our biggest security threat that we face here in Oregon. And I couldn't agree more. The place where I would actually expand that is I think we need to go well beyond elementary and middle and high school curriculum. The reality is I'm more likely to receive false information or fake news from my aunt than I am from my niece. I think we have an entire generation of Oregonians who understandably grew up in an era where if Walter Cronkite said it on TV, then it was true. They didn't have to kind of check the credibility of what appeared to be credible news sources. But I think this is a time where we actually need to use that director of civic education to help all Oregonians spot misinformation and fake news, and to do it in a robust and interesting way. One frustration I always have with the way that government communicates is we recognize that we're in an environment where advertisers and nonprofits and entertainment is all trying to put out information in interesting and entertaining ways to grab people's attention. And then government speaks, and it has to make sure that everything looks super plain and super boring and doesn't capture people's attention. And so I think that we also need to actually be forward thinking in the way that we communicate, and not just make it really plain. Here, download this PDF on this website, when everyone else is out there competing with live video in more interesting ways. So we need to actually reform how we communicate with Oregonians to make sure that we're actually competing in the marketplace of ideas and capturing Oregonians' attention with teaching them how to spot misinformation. So yes to elementary and middle and high school curriculum, but beyond that, all Oregonians deserve to know the best information about how to spot misinformation and how to only share credible information and accurate news sources. And I would champion that as Secretary of State.
Mark?
Yes, I would second a lot of what Shemia said. The Secretary of State does have this operation of the Civics Toolkit. They call it an Oregon-centric guide to election civics. Students, I think it's 16 to 24, covering everything from voting history to Oregon history to everything you need to know before you register to vote. And I would incorporate that into what I would establish as Office of Elections Cybersecurity to help with this intentional misinformation campaign that is haunting all elections offices around the world. And even the Oregon Secretary of State's office, just in the last election cycle, was haunted by this, by two viral posts. One said that it was too late to vote in Southern Oregon. Another said they were already counting ballots in Morrow County before the elections had closed. Neither one of those were true, but we need to engage Oregonians about what is true, get out in front of these misinformation campaigns through tools like the Civics Toolkit, and make sure that everybody knows where to go for a sort of a truth squad site. That here's what's true. This rumor is not true. And it's a disturbing reality that we have to live with in our election cycle, but through technology and through human operations like the civics operation and the civics toolkit, I think we can get there. And I think we can do a better job than we're doing now of protecting elections from this threat.
Jamie?
Well, when I talk about protecting democracy, I talk about both election security and election integrity. Election security is, of course, cybersecurity, but also fighting misinformation campaigns. And we've been talking about this for months. This is nothing new. And it's also working with county clerks to ensure they have the support and training and resources necessary. So when steps go forward, like adding postage to ballots, it was a very good legislation. However, it was not funded separately, so that came out of the Secretary of State's office. So it was a robbing Peter to pay Paul on that. That was a mistake in terms of the action taken on that, because you're then taking away resources. So making sure also that Oregon has a national presence on improving voter access across the country is something that I would lead on, and making sure that all those security pieces are taken. But election integrity is really about making sure all our voices are heard. And like I said, I'm hearing from Oregonians across our state, rural Democrats and communities of color in urban areas who are really frustrated with the lack of being heard in the legislature in Salem right now. So the way we need to move forward, yes, work with community-based organizations. I'm really proud of the support I've got from RICE, a young Latinx organization out in Eastern Oregon, who are struggling with the lack of access to information. And we've been working together for several years, worked very closely together on No on Measure 105 campaign, but making sure that There's outreach, working with community-based organizations. That's what civics is. That's where the shortfall in many cases is happening right now. Making sure that information is available in different languages. So I'm the only campaign who had translated my not just my website, but also we had literature that was in 5 different languages. This is standard for my campaign, so that outreach. Also making sure that folks who don't have access to the internet have other resources as well. We're seeing this right now with distance learning. So making sure that civics education isn't, yes, improving information on the website, but really working more interactively with Oregonians. And one of the things that, part of the question is, how would you be a Secretary of State? Well, look at what we're doing now. So I'm engaging in many civics lessons that we're sending out on social media. It's a 2-way interaction. I'm big on 2-way interactions rather than just 1-way shoving out information. But Monday, Wednesday, Fridays at noon, I do live streams that are mini civics lessons on the Secretary of State and policy ideas around that. We've been doing that since COVID-19 hit. We're also doing interactions and interviews with community leaders that need to be heard. I recently interviewed a Latinx council member from Hermiston who was talking about our need. He was highlighting and daylighting the impact that COVID-19 is having on farm workers right now. We talk about the heroes out in the field, but we're not doing enough to help our farm workers. So making sure that folks who are not typically heard, and definitely folks who are not currently at the table and don't have a seat at the table in the legislature or in Salem right now, those are the voices we need to bring in, because that will then change politics and make sure more voices are heard.
Thank you. We have a question. I've rephrased it a little bit, but from the Facebook feed. In your role on the Oregon Land Board, how would you evaluate the position of special interests in protecting Oregon's environment, wetlands, and water?
Who goes first?
Oh, I'm sorry. That's you, Mark.
Okay. This is a perplexing problem for land board members because there's no guiding light. There's no North Star when it comes to non-liquid assets. The statutes in the Constitution says highest permanent value, and that's what the common school fund manages. And so if it was a regular endowment or a regular foundation, if you had an asset that wasn't performing, you would sell it like a stock. You would sell a stock and buy a stock that might look better or do better. But you can't do that with assets that are acres of forest land. And so that's when things start to come to a crash. And of course, the most famous place is the Elliott Forest decision a couple years ago. And so what I would propose is a public process in which the public can set as guiding principles what they want the common school fund to do. Do they want to preserve these lands and set it up for recreation or ecology or logging, or what are the principles? Or do they think they should act like a regular foundation and sell those lands at any price just to maximize the assets, which are then benefiting Oregon schools? And there is no guiding light there on what to do. What is exactly the highest permanent principle? So we saw what happened with the Elliott. It was kind of a herky-jerky decision for the state to kind of sell it to itself. But there are also other land questions, like what happened a couple of months ago when the land board sold off some property over in Bend for a housing subdivision, which actually made sense. It wasn't ecological property, had no environmental value, and yet it was a case-by-case basis. And so what I'm saying is there is no route, there is no blueprint on how you should follow. Personally, if I were on the land board back then, I just would not have sold the Elliott. It's a state treasure, and we should have preserved it. And while this process of us buying it from ourselves and kind of managing it in a process that's only halfway through, I don't think is the most elegant way to do it. I still support it just as long as it's that land is preserved for what I think Oregonians expect it to be preserved for, which is for the environment, for an ecosystem, and for research. So that would be my suggestion, to start up a process where we can find a North Star on those kinds of very difficult decisions.
Jamie?
Yeah, so the perspective I bring to this, I'm a natural resource attorney. I've worked on designing water systems as an engineer, and I actually, when I got my master's in regional planning, it was a focus on watershed management. I serve on the OWEB board, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, was appointed by the governor, and my law degree focused on water law, natural resource law, and Indian law. I also worked for 5 years as an environmental planner for a regional water agency that served over 2 million people in urban and rural areas. So that analysis piece is what I bring to review of issues on the land board. I appreciate Mark's comments. What I've been talking about for a while is having this comprehensive planning process. It's like with cities where you have a general plan and then you have zoning. The general plan is that big picture concept. It's similar to actually what the governor's doing right now with the 100-year water vision, but doing that for our state lands, because we need to be protecting them, not just for current Oregonians, but for future generations as well. So we need to develop that comprehensive plan. But for me, the bottom line principles is public land is public. We don't get rid of it. And then also we need to recognize multiple values, and including ecological values of our state lands, and making sure those are preserved in any kind of long-term planning. You know, again, that the multiple values, the multiple factors. I disagree with where the process has gone to now for the Elliott State Forest. I think we should revisit and make sure we're incorporating tribal communities in terms of the decision making. If having it be research related, I think could be fine, except for it needs to involve more than just the Department of Forestry. But there's other environmental issues we should be looking at that involve the land board, including LNG. And you know, in some cases, you'll have candidates who are supported by organizations that have no overlap on that project, but I'm really proud of being consistent on that one. And then lastly, with regard to the land that Mark referenced, what happened is they were public lands that were then, the urban growth boundary was expanded and that land went within the city. And so it was sold off to developers. But one of the things we could have done that would have been more creative, especially in this housing crisis, and this is something I did when I was on the Santa Clara City Council, we partnered with the school district and also with a nonprofit housing developer to develop low-cost, affordable housing for our educators. It was a way to make sure we were helping the school district and helping our teachers by providing with accessible housing. The other thing we could have done, because it's land that went inside the urban growth area, was to provide those resources and low-cost housing also for first responders. So that's part of the long-term planning. If it's a public resource, we should be thinking about in terms of the public's best use.
Shemia.
Sure, I want to note that for, I'm sure, a lot of your people watching this, it's hard to hear 3 Democrats kind of talk about environmental issues and to know where to fall. One thing that I will point to, I'm very proud of, is that the Oregon League of Conservation voters interviewed all of us. This was their primary issue. I mean, they hammered this issue for about half of my interview, and I'm very proud that they chose to endorse me in this race because of my strong environmental record. And so in terms of, I mean, obviously the Elliott Forest is the old growth forest that we know the most, but there are of course other old growth forests that we need to look out for as members of the State Land Board. I think that, you know, I share a lot of the concerns of my colleagues, Jamie and Mark, but one of the things that hasn't been mentioned yet is the possibility of it being used by Oregon State University as an ecological research forest. And one of the big concerns for the environmental community there is that it's not just kind of the sideburns aren't only put there by the Department of Forestry, but also to make sure there's not only a corresponding voice for environmentalists at the table, but actually an equal voice to make sure that we don't just end up letting OSU use it for uses that we would otherwise not allow the forest to be used for. And so one guiding star for me is I would definitely not sell it to a company that wanted to use it for logging. And I'm very proud in this race to have signed the No Fossil Fuels Money pledge, and certainly would not be taking money from folks like Lone Rock Timber and others who actually sought to purchase the Elliott Forest in order to log it. And so I'm very proud to be endorsed by the Oregon League of Conservation Voters, which might help give some of the Democrats out there who are hearing kind of similar views from all of us, at least an outside perspective on this issue.
I think this next one is for Jamie, if I have my letters right. What will you do to encourage Oregon's 16 and 17-year-olds to register and then actually vote when they reach 18?
Well, I think we should be dropping the voting age to 16. And that's something that's very important to me as a member of the Jefferson County Education Service District Board. I think it's a way to help develop a voting culture and engage more young people in the voting process. And also to make sure more voices are heard on progressive issues, like environmental issues. It's younger voters who are excited about this and who actually are trying to push change and push through change that moves beyond the failure we've seen in the legislature around climate issues. I'm very proud to be supported by progressive environmental issues and by younger voters who are concerned about climate issues. Those folks who are looking for a leader, someone with a track record of leading on this, and someone who's not stuck in the status quo, are endorsing me, as well as statewide leaders from Jackie Dingfelder, who helped to develop OWEB, to Alyssa Kenny-Geyer, to Jeff Golden, Senator Golden in Southern Oregon, Jenna Goodman-Campbell, Kaiser City Councilmember Roland Herrera, folks who are really concerned about environment and how we can move it forward. That's helping to tap into those younger voters. In terms of reaching out to communities, it's doing, again, a lot of the stuff that I've talked about in terms of outreach. This is also a track record I had from 2018 when I traveled throughout 20 of the 36 counties, put over 45,000 miles on my Jeep back when we could travel around and meet with folks face to face, and really engaged younger voices in elections. We also invested and supported the development of young leaders. So I mentioned the support of Rice is out in Hermiston, and it's a young Latinx group who is looking to develop leadership in Eastern Oregon amongst young Dems, amongst the Latinx community. They're strongly supporting me because they know that I'm stepping up for voices who are not being heard. So it's a matter of showing up. It's a matter of supporting younger voices. But I think we should be working to drop the voting age, and then just more engagement across our state. That type of outreach, also groups like Apano, who've endorsed me in the metro area. The work that needs to be done is to bring voices to the table that are not being heard. So many young people that I've talked to feel frustrated by the continued fighting and divisiveness that's going on in the legislature and the walkouts we've seen in the last 2 years. That was embarrassing for Oregonians. We had national news on that. And that system, a lot of people say either my vote doesn't count, I'm not being heard, or look at politics, it's such a mess. So those of us who have worked at the local level and worked in government and helped to help voices be heard, especially communities of color and especially vulnerable communities, that's work I've done before. I'm not just talking about it now. I did that before, in helping people actually to become citizens, to get access to their right to vote. That's work I've done for years. It's not something that I'm just coming up with now because I'm running for office. And that's why so many organizations and folks on the ground who don't already have a seat at the table are supporting me in this race.
Shemia.
Sure. Well, this is actually something I have very strong experience with. I actually sponsored SJR 22 in the 2019 session, which would have referred a constitutional amendment to Oregon voters to lower the voting age to 16. And I can tell you that the knee-jerk, we got national news. Rush Limbaugh went off on us about this, was on a national podcast talking about it. But the knee-jerk response for most people, Republicans and Democrats, particularly kind of older Democrats, was no, 16 is too young. And so we fielded a lot of those complaints, and we realized that we have a long way to go to get this to successfully pass the Oregon ballot. Because of course you don't just want to pass something in the legislature that then ends up going and falling on its face, and you set the movement back many years. We faced that for years when we were looking at when we put marriage equality on the ballot here in Oregon. But we got thousands and thousands and thousands of responses from across Oregon, but I could boil them down to about 5 buckets, and I won't go through all the buckets now, but the one that I found the most disheartening was people would say things like, oh, young people are too busy eating Tide Pods to vote, or they would give other disparaging comments about young 16 and 17-year-olds. And so when I responded to that, I actually led a hearing during spring break of young people to come to the Capitol and testify on SJR 22. And I closed that hearing by simply clicking through a slideshow, and I'll try and recreate it for you. The first slide was a probably mid-30-year-old dude with a glass beer bottle sticking out of his fly with firecrackers in there, and then he was kind of doing a 4th of July dance, and then he all of a sudden lit himself on fire and had to jump on the ground, which everybody kind of laughed. The second slide was a New York Times report showing that voters 65 and older were actually the most likely to share false information during the last election. The third slide was a story of horrific child abuse committed by 2 people in their 40s. And the fourth slide was a picture of the Las Vegas massacre. And I did all that in silence. And then I simply said, I have an idea. why do we not define Oregon's 16 and 17-year-olds by the worst behavior of their peers? And if we are lucky, they won't define us by the worst behavior of our peers. And I think that's the key. There are many people that everybody can think of from every age group who people probably would think, are, immature or not making wise decisions, but you don't have to earn your right to vote in Oregon, or in the US. You have your right to vote as being a citizen. And so I do think that we should continue to build the coalition in Oregon that would be willing to amend that at the Constitution and lower Oregon's voting age to 16 and 17. The reason we lowered the voting age in the 70s from 21 to 18 was because of the young people who were impacted by being drafted in the Vietnam War, who were 18 and yet they couldn't actually vote. The same issue is true of our young people today who are affected by college affordability, housing insecurity, gun violence, climate change, and many other issues that are shaping their very futures, and yet they don't have a voice at the ballot box. I think that it's time to build the coalition, however long it takes, to pass that at the Oregon ballot.
Mark?
I talk to young people a lot in high schools, and I think this is a great place to register 16-year-olds in addition to the DMV. I mean, let's not forget that we're way ahead of most states in registering 16-year-olds to vote and getting them so that they're ready to go when they do turn of age. I had a teenager here, and I remember her voting for the first time. And I think a bigger issue of age is convincing them why they need to vote. And so many people think, well, my vote doesn't count. It's not going to matter. And I just have to go through with my daughter and others, the cases where 1 or 2 votes made a difference in an election. Kate Brown won her very first election by 7 votes. When I was a news guy years ago, I covered a city council race. It was decided by a coin flip because the vote ended in a tie. So votes do matter. It goes back to the question of civics education. And I think it's just more adults being more active in the lives of young people to get them ready to go. But what I found in the high schools, and I speak to a lot of high schools, is that there's no shortage of people who are interested in our government, in our democracy. And we can always find bad cases here and there, whether they're 16, 18, or 46 or 48. I just think it's an attitude, it's an ethos to get people behind government and understand what democracy is about. A few weeks ago when we were discussing lowering the voting age to 16, I made the remark that as someone, and I think I might be the only person in the race who's had a teenager go through their house, and most people who have raised teenagers might think differently. But I also came up with this great compromise that I know Shemia and Jamie like, that maybe we could lower the age to 16 for women and raise the age to 30 for men. So I don't know.
I think there might be problems with that, Mark, but also just to say I'm a stepmom of 4, and so I've had the teenager experience as well.
So the next question would go to Shemia, and I think it's going to be a really short one because of the question right before. Should Oregonians under the age of 18 have the right to vote in state and local elections?
Yes, and it will be a short one, but I want to actually, the way that the question is worded, I think is important, because there are some cities and states who have proposed only lowering the voting age for things like school board elections. And I actually think that does a disservice to our 16 and 17-year-olds and sets them up to fail, because they'll end up looking like they're not very engaged, because even current voting age adults have lower turnouts on those races as opposed to president, senator, governor, and those other races. The reality is I'm in the state Senate, young people are not coming to me, for the most part, talking about school board issues. They're talking about gun violence. They're talking about housing insecurity. They're talking about college affordability and wage discrepancy and gender discrimination and LGBTQIA issues. And so to only limit them to be able to vote on certain elections, I think actually sets them up to fail and sets them up to look like they're not engaged voters. If they're going to have the right to vote, they should have the right to vote in all elections. And again, I want to set appropriate expectations. What I learned in SJR 22 and putting that out there last year was we have a long way to go in Oregon. Even in my own Democratic caucus, there were good folks who I agree with on a lot of issues who were like, 16 seems too young. And so I think that we have a lot of work to do to get Oregonians to a place where they'll be willing to actually pass that for all elections.
Mark.
I do not favor it right now. I think, we just had a legislative session in 2017 where we raised the age for people to buy cigarettes to 21, where the drinking age is 21. So I'm not sure Oregonians are in a place where we lower the age. I'm not sure the problem where this is trying to fix. When I talk to high schoolers, I honestly do not see a clamoring for this the way that I see high schoolers clamoring for a climate bill or a smart climate policy. I don't see them rushing after this. So I guess if you want a short answer, my answer is no, not yet.
Jamie.
Yes, and to the point of how we implement it successfully is that strategic conversation, but it would be an overall change the Constitution that would allow that. Again, the challenge that's been voiced by both my colleagues is getting enough people on board. So that implementation piece is important. But I would actually challenge the thought that younger folks are not that concerned about school board and ESD boards. There's tremendous interest in how these resources are being spent, and tremendous interest in the impact these organizations are having on their lives. So here in Jefferson County, where I serve on the Education Service District Board, when I propose a policy to the ESD and recommend to the superintendent to bring it forward to the other school districts to protect our kids and their families from ICE, that is something that is not even being done in the metro area, but that's something that's critically important for the security of our kids. And I can tell you for a fact that a majority of the kids in Jefferson County would care about that, because when you look at Jefferson County and the diversity of our schools and our kids and our families, Madras High School is the largest school in Jefferson County. And the demographics of Madras High are a third tribal kids, a third Latinx kids, and a third Caucasian kids. And so with that level of diversity and the needs that are being met and the impact on families, vulnerable families, that is what needs to be addressed. And I know for a fact that younger folks are very interested in that. I also know folks in our community are. Former council member, Latinx council member from Madras, Denise Pisa, who's also endorsing me. She has been very active in the Latinx community, both here and now she's now moved more to the metro area. But it's something that she's raised, and is one of the reasons why she's strongly supporting me, because I'm actually addressing the issues and engaging students. But that can be done at not just at all levels, including the ESD level and school board level as well.
Okay, so
if I could step out of line for a second, Marcia, I guess if this is a differentiating point with my two colleagues, I would ask about the inconsistency in state policy, where we now say to young people, you're not allowed, we don't think you should be able to buy tobacco until you're 21. But on the other hand, we think you should be able to vote and make important decisions when you're 16. That feels like an inconsistency.
And I'm happy to address that, because I mentioned there were 5 buckets that the criticisms came into, and that was one of them.
Okay.
And
I don't know if you're in the legislature yet. Did you vote for the tobacco 21 bill?
Yeah, comparing, I support the raising the smoking age. Comparing voting to things like tobacco and drinking, other folks would use gambling and pornography as examples. Those are social harms that we want people to delay their actual activity till later in life so they don't develop lifelong habits. Voting is something we want people to actually develop a lifelong habit. Voting is not in the category of smoking and drinking and gambling and pornography. Voting is in the category of young people who get a job when they turn 16, or volunteer for their church or community organizations, or get a bank account and start saving. It is actually a social good that we want young people to actually develop and habit early in life. The most common predictor of if someone will vote in the next election is if they voted in the last election. Yet we have young people voting for the first time when they're 18, 19, 20. They're living in transitory places. Sometimes they're in college or living with friends. They actually don't have the chance to have that conversation. So voting is not like smoking and drinking and gambling and pornography. It's a social good that we want to develop a lifelong habit.
I think you missed the debate back in it wasn't about tobacco. It was about, we don't think that young people's minds can make it about tobacco.
Jamie, would you like one final little shot for a few? Yeah.
I'll say I agree with Shemia on this one. It's a habit we want to form. The one other thing I'll say about it is I've had teachers, educators, civics teachers talk to me about how they don't want to just talk about voting as theoretical to their students, their high school students. They want to be able to actually engage them, and dropping the voting age would help to engage and, again, develop that voting culture. And when we talk to younger folks and civic leaders who are under 18, that's something they're asking for, because they want to step up as leaders. We need their leadership. It's not something we're giving to younger folks. It's something that we need from them, because the leaders that we're building now are going to be taking things in a direction where we have all failed. Talk about climate change. We continue to fail on climate change, but younger people will lead and will make it happen. And that's why we have to empower them with the vote.
Okay. We're going on to the next question, which would be Senator Haas. And that is, Secretary of State Clarno recently laid off 7 employees who specialized in election security. What is your plan to ensure Oregon's elections are secure going forward?
I would open an office of cybersecurity. I would go the other direction, and instead of laying off security people, I think that is the absolute worst thing we could be doing. We should be going in a different direction. Our problem with our security in our election system today is in the registered voter database. We need more secure firewalls that exist today, which are merely compliant with federal law. The technology experts all say the same thing, that while that complies with federal law, it's still not safe as it should be. Vote by mail is great. We're protected from massive voter fraud because, as we always say, you can't hack paper. But we are vulnerable in this registered database, and we need to fix it. And in this Office of Cybersecurity, which I'm amazed there isn't one that exists now, is also the Office of Patrolling and Fixing Disinformation and Misinformation. That's where these security experts should be working. We should have more than 7 in there. We shouldn't be laying them off. We should have more. And so while I hate to second guess anybody who's an elected official now, for me, I will make sure we have a very beefed up security operation around election security. For me, as Secretary of State, that has to be the highest priority given the age we live in of interference and meddling in our elections.
Jamie?
I will second guess in this case, because I strongly disagree with the stance taken. And when we were on a call, when the Secretary Clarno invited us all to be on a call to talk about elections, I specifically asked about this issue because it was something that I'm concerned about. I've talked since the beginning, since last fall, I've been talking about needing to appoint an election security officer, because right now there's different folks who wear multiple hats in the office, in the elections office. We need someone who's appointed to think like a hacker and to make sure that we're protecting the data and protecting Oregonians and protecting our right to vote. So we do need more people in that role. The other thing with the audit process is another thing I've been talking about since the beginning is information security as part of our audit process. So making sure that in the elections office, but in other, the DMV, other agencies as well that interact and touch the elections process, we need to make sure that that information is secure. That's something that's critically important. It will take staffing. It'll take people who are experts in those areas. And that's something I'd be absolutely committed to allocating staff to. The other thing is, again, going to the legislature, because the legislature holds the purse strings, and allocating those resources. We need champions of democracy in the legislature who will pass policies that we need to have better democracy here in Oregon, and also make those resources available. The other key thing is working with county clerks. I've met with county clerks throughout our state in urban and rural areas, and they're working very hard because our elections are essentially at the county level. And making sure that they have a strong advocate, that they're fully resourced, that they get the training and support that they need is something that I would be a champion of as well. And making sure also that when we talk about these ideas, that we're running them through the people who actually have to implement them and have to interact with them, so that we make sure our ideas are tested. What I've seen so common amongst kind of big picture policymakers, people who have not actually had the on the ground experience that happen to actually implement things. That's why executive management is so important in this role, because you have to understand how government actually works and how to implement stuff. I'm the only one with that experience. So big picture ideas are great, but unless you've thought through how you're going to implement them, thought through the pluses and minuses, the challenges, and bake that into the decision making and to the policy, you're going to have problems. And so making sure that those resources are in place, that we've talked to the folks who have to implement them, and that's part of the process, and that we're fully resourced are all things that will help to make our elections more secure.
Shemia?
Yeah, so I certainly share the concerns of my colleagues about the layoffs, and it went by, to be clear, it wasn't just layoffs. It was actually layoffs in the election security team, and then actually some privatization through a private firm to do some of that same work. So privatizing our elections is the last direction we need to be going in. So I have very big concerns about that. And you know, as folks who are running for a particular office, I do think it's fair to, you know, to say where you disagree with somebody currently holding that position. And so I do certainly disagree with Secretary Clarno on that point. You know, in terms of cybersecurity, there is a cybersecurity team that's organized under the chief, the CIO, the chief intelligence officer that we created in the legislature. So they did do a, you know, kind of a comprehensive cybersecurity overview, and they have a cybersecurity plan that we need to implement those standards from. That plan was from 2019. So we need to implement that. I think as Secretary of State, it's gonna be a really tough time to go to the legislature asking for any new resources. We're gonna have to look at current budgets and prioritize what really matters, because the legislature, speaking as a senator, is gonna be focusing on literally making sure folks have food on the table, schools are able to open, people have housing, people have health care. And so I think that it's going to be very hard to consider the legislature having any purse strings right now. And we need to make sure that we look at our current budget and prioritize, particularly for those next 3, 4, 5 years as we're recovering from this pandemic. But another concern that I have in the cybersecurity realm is also the use of kind of the testing of the waters of online voting apps. I think those, they're being piloted right now. I could go ahead and assume the pilots are going to go really well, because why would anybody hack a pilot, right? If you want to hack voting, if you want to actually have people believe they can go to online voting, then obviously you make sure the pilots go well. And then once actually people have implemented those systems and relied on those, then you actually do the hacking. So I have also grave concerns about moving towards any type of experimentation with online voting. I know those are for overseas and military, and I know that we obviously need to make sure that those folks have an accessible ballot, but I do have concerns about any kind of moving voting to online because of our concerns about cybersecurity. It's a place, I'm not old school in a lot of places, but this is a place where I'm very old school. Paper ballots filled out by hand, mailed in, and then we keep those paper ballots so that we can do any kind of audit to make sure that our elections are secure. And that's why we can be so proud of our secure and accessible and safe elections here in Oregon.
Okay. Next question on Jamie starts out. Will you commit to prosecuting anyone who intentionally sends mails, broadcasts intentional misinformation about Oregon election dates or Oregon election laws? And that was a question from the Facebook page.
Yes.
Shemia.
Oh, yes. I mean, the question is intentional. So we have to make sure that people that are spreading misinformation are fully held accountable to the full extent of the law. It's unacceptable. Mark gave some examples earlier of intentional spreading of misinformation, but it's an example of you can't just do it after the fact, because then folks have actually, you know, been influenced by that. So that's what we need, as I mentioned early, really using that director of civic education to really help Oregonians understand and see misinformation as the biggest security threat facing Oregon elections right now, as the secretary, or excuse me, as the elections director mentioned, and I've been saying since the beginning of this campaign. And so we got to make sure that we not only prosecute it after the fact, but make sure that we're actually catching it when it's happening. And again, also meeting people in those same mediums. You can't just share the correct information in kind of a static post or on a PDF if people are sharing the misinformation through live digital ads or other types of medium. You have to meet that same misinformation where it is to make sure the same Oregonians who are seeing the misinformation see the corrected information, and most importantly, have the tools to spot misinformation the next time.
Mark.
Yes, prosecute to the full extent possible, but I think a better idea is to prevent it from happening in the first place. And one of the ways you do that is you put social media companies on notice through the Attorney General's office that Oregon will not tolerate this anymore. We will not tolerate them facilitating disinformation and misinformation campaigns, which is what happened in the current Secretary of State's office and previous. Haven't done that yet. And I think this is a changing time in our country and in our state when it comes to social media. And I think they are now starting to answer and starting to behave better. We'll see through the next cycle. But That is a big part of the problem, in that these huge social media companies allow this to happen, and in some cases facilitate it. And I think we need to give them a very strong reason to never do that in Oregon.
Okay. The next question is starting with Shemia. What process will you use in determining what agencies to audit?
Well, this is a very timely question. All of us were able to attend a briefing today with Kip Memmott, who is the current director of the Audits Division. And I don't know, maybe my colleagues already knew everything there was to know about the Audits Division, but I really learned a lot, and I really appreciated the time that he spent. And I just want to share some of that information with Oregonians. I think it's really useful. The fact that the Secretary of State's office can perform 10 to 13 performance audits a year. We've been asked in a lot of these forums, what's the one agency that you would audit? And I think it's wonderful to learn that we don't have to just choose one. But he also mentioned that even as they develop their 2021 audit plan, some of which is already developed, they are leaving room for the next Secretary of State who's elected to have an input on that as well. And one thing that I found both heartening and disheartening was the fact that there was an audit already planned for disease prevention and response. Not just, this is before COVID was a big deal. This is something that he's had on the docket for a couple of years and just never reached the level of an audit that was performed. And while it wouldn't have solved everything with our COVID response, it would certainly have already shown some of the cracks early, and potentially could have made a really big difference in the lives of some Oregonians. And so we have to lead with values. This is a place where the Audits Division, once it's doing its work, it follows the U.S. government auditing standard. It follows peer review and evidence standards. So you don't mess with the audits when they're happening. But the Secretary of State does have a key role in deciding where we need to be auditing, and of course you have to look at risk assessment, and that's the big goal in deciding where we're going to audit. And again, audits cost money, and this is going to be a very tight budget, I think, coming up for the next several years as we recover from this recession. But you have to look at big risks. And I think a key measure here for the Secretary of State is risks not just for the general population, but always making sure that we're looking through an equity lens to find out for underserved and underrepresented communities who have been failed or historically failed by our democratic institutions. What are the big risks facing those communities, to make sure that we're always taking an equity lens to our audits and not just looking at problems facing the vast majority of Oregonians, but making sure that our Black and Indigenous and people of color and underserved and underrepresented communities, that they're also at the forefront of our decision making regarding what the big risks are and where we should audit.
Mark.
Yeah, I plan on taking a hands-on role on audits. It plays to my DNA, I think, as with a background in journalism, holding people accountable, holding institutions accountable, holding agencies accountable. People care about their tax dollars. I talk to a lot of people who say, I don't mind paying taxes, I just want it to be spent well. And that's important to me too. So my criteria for audits would be eliminating waste, ensuring that laws are followed as intended, protecting children in foster care, ensuring state agencies minimize their carbon footprint, and making sure agencies and their contractors comply with all of our ethics and diversity standards. I had been saying up until about a month ago that my very first audit would be on the Student Success Act that I helped lead in the last legislative session. It was a transformative, historic bill with $1 billion a year dedicated to K through 12 schools and early learning. And I want to make sure that money gets into classrooms and doesn't get hijacked by the bureaucracy or by the legislature. And on the other side of that equation, the corporations who will pay that tax, I want to make sure they're paying it and not gaming the system. The tax has been in place since January, and already I can see signs that maybe some of that is in our future. So that would be my first audit pre-virus. And now, as I think we talked about earlier, I think that sets the stage for an overview, a comprehensive look at how we dealt with this crisis, what we could have done better, how we can better prepare for the next emergency should it come.
Jamie.
Well, I'm always excited to get audit questions because I got a lot of experience here, and this is not where this is a place where you shouldn't be learning on the job for as Secretary of State. So audits are essentially how we can make government better and more accountable. It's also a way that we can help build public trust, address what we need to change, and then build public trust by showing that we're doing it. The public needs to know how our taxpayer dollars are being spent. And so making sure there's transparency and people find out we target the right audits, we engage in them, we look at not just finding the issues, finding out what's working well, what needs to change, but then also how we go about changing it. And I've got strategies for all of those. My philosophy always, going back to when I was first elected in 2004, is that we're not supposed to just spend public dollars, we're supposed to invest them. And making sure that we're showing how they're invested is really what you do through the audit process. So again, I've dealt with this as frontline staff, as manager, as an elected official overseeing a city that's larger than a state Senate district, 1,000 staff, multiple divisions, and I served in the audit committee there. We just went through an audit process with the Jefferson County ESC and the review. So making sure we have the resources well spent within the office, and then also training and supporting other local governments, smaller governments, and agencies that need those resources. So the Secretary of State selects what's audited, how it's audited, and then identifies which agencies to target. With regard to the what, and this is something I've been talking about for a long time, mimicry is the greatest form of flattery, so it's been really fun to start hearing my colleagues talk about this more and more now recently. But you don't have just financial audits, you have performance audits and equity audits, sustainability audits, safety audits, information security audits. Using a health and safety lens, I think, is really critical to bring the focus on that how we can best spend our resources and how are we taking care of Oregonians. Then with regard to the criteria, it's that health and safety lens that obviously everyone's thinking about post COVID-19 and looking at preparedness, how we can do that better, but also looking at vulnerable communities, our kids, our seniors, undocumented folks within our state who are some of the most vulnerable right now. We need to make sure that that's being captured, and we're seeing that. Our educators, almost a quarter of our educators are leaving on an annual basis. And so the legislature doesn't want to talk about class size, but class size is a health and safety issue, not just for our kids, but for our educators as well. We can look at that through audits using a health and safety lens. Forensics, the Oregon State Police Crime Lab, there have been wrongful convictions. So making sure that the data is correct so things are done fairly. Demographic discrepancies, our elections, yes, each election is audited at that time, just afterwards, and the equipment's audited, but we should be looking at the discrepancies we have right now. As Secretary of State, I would look to increase overall voter turnout, but also decrease the discrepancies between different demographics. And this is really playing out the discrepancies in things like distance learning and the different resources that people have access to. That's what we should be daylighting. Financial issues as well. We've seen information about Travel Oregon and the spikes in salaries. Forestry budget there was some issues there last year. So that's some of the deep dive that we look at. So as Secretary of State, you develop the process and criteria. Then you, of course, let the professionals do their job and don't influence. But then you're daylighting issues. You're also bringing it to the legislature's attention by developing things like key performance measures. So essentially the report card for state agencies, what they report out every year, incorporating that. Those are all ways to make changes.
You're out of time.
Okay.
Okay. The next question we had from Facebook, and we had one already prepared. And this is going to Mark first. Are you running for Secretary of State or Governor in waiting? Do you pledge to serve the full time and not run for governor in 2022?
I pledge that, yes. I have always served out my entire term. I have never run in midterm for any other office. And my goal is to be the next Secretary of State, period.
Jamie, you're next.
I wouldn't have been so excited about audits had I not been excited about actually doing the job. I absolutely commit to filling out my full term. Like Mark, I have never quit. I've never moved into and covered bagged into a district. I've never left a seat. I've always served my full term. I want to do this job. I'm excited about the opportunity to make life better for Oregonians as Secretary of State, and I will not run for governor in 2022.
Well, I am certainly running for Secretary of State to be the next Secretary of State. One oversight that I think my colleagues are overlooking is that a constitutional responsibility of Secretary of State is also serving as the Lieutenant Governor. So of every position in Oregon, this is one to which you cannot commit to not serve as governor if called upon. Secretary of State Kate Brown became governor in January of 2015. Unexpectedly, I was in the legislature at the time. So I'm certainly running for this to be the Secretary of State in Oregon. I'm very excited. As I mentioned earlier, I've been working on and expanding access for small businesses and voter access since I joined the legislature. And so I have a strong history on these issues. I've been very excited about being Secretary of State, but I do take the role of Lieutenant Governor very seriously. And we just saw that in 2015. So while I'm not running to be governor, I'm certainly running for Secretary of State. I just want to make sure that nuance is there to be fair to Oregon voters, that is a constitutional responsibility of Secretary of State.
Let's answer that question as well.
Everybody's had a chance for that question. We have a couple more. And Jamie, you're on this first. Do you think there is any possibility of the Secretary of State being independent of the state budget by using income from its corporation division?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Do you think there is any possibility of the Secretary of State being independent of the state budget by using income from its corporation division?
So it sounds like it would be then taxing corporations just for that function. Now, if you carved out the business corporation, the registering business, as a separate function, and if fees were able to support that, that's one thing. But the Secretary of State is also oversees elections, also the state archives, also in addition to registering businesses, obviously audits, also serves as Lieutenant Governor and is a backstop for redistricting and is one of three on the land board. And so those are all separate roles. You would not be able to essentially tax business to pay for all those separate other features. If it was something that was specific to the role of corporations, and there was like many state agencies already do, is that they support most of their budget through the fees of folks receiving those benefits, those services. But that is just one piece of the Secretary of State. So to the overall question, no, I don't think so, because you're asking then people registering for business. I'm a small business owner. It was asking business owners to then pay for all those other functions, I think is a stretch. So I do think that the legislature should be, and taxpayers should be, investing and paying for things like our elections and keeping our elections safe and secure.
Shemia?
So the good news is that based on the research that I've done, the corporate division actually is self-sustaining. And not only is it self-sustaining, they actually send money back to the legislature each year through the fees that are assessed through that. But as I think Jamie pointed out very, very well, that's one function of the Secretary of State. The key function of the Secretary of State is our elections officer. And so we need to make sure that is fully funded and not rely simply on the corporate division for that. But the corporate division, the research that I've done is that it is actually, that division is self-sustaining and actually sends money back. We also don't want to have a system where we are, just to get businesses in the door to register for a, to do business, a B corporation, an LLC, a nonprofit, or whatever business entity, to have to constantly raise those fees. That's the gateway to entry for Oregonians. That's not supposed to be a tax. That's supposed to be just that registration fee. So I agree with Jamie that we don't want to be raising that on businesses that are just getting in the door and wanting to do business. And again, nonprofits and also benefit corporations here in Oregon. I do think it's important. I'm very supportive of our progressive taxation system in Oregon, where those who have the most pay the most. And so I do think that the legislature should continue to fund the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State is not a, kind of division of the governor's office or something. The Secretary of State is its own constitutional office, independently elected in Oregon, and I believe that it also needs to be funded as such.
Mark?
Thank you. I just want to amend the previous question about whether we're really running for governor, and I think I answered that question. I think Jamie answered that question, but Shemia did not. The budget for Secretary of State is pretty complex. For example, the audits division is paid by the agencies that get audited. And there was a small section of general fund revenues that help pay for the elections, overseeing the elections. I think the Secretary of State's office should be larger. I think the Secretary of State's office and the state should do a better job of helping local county elections offices. And that's really important because most counties are strapped. Most of these election directors that I've talked to in recent months are really trying to stretch themselves with security considerations, staff, and just making sure that these elections run. I do appreciate the thought of trying to find some way to better fund the Secretary of State's office to the Corporations Division. I'm not sure that one would work.
Okay. We have two more questions before close, and so I'm going to go to the Facebook question, and that would be going to Shemia. Would you support full public financing of Oregon elections? This includes a complete ban, as far as legally possible, all corporate and personal contributions.
I would absolutely support publicly funded elections. I think that realistically, that's where we have to go. I don't think under the Constitution you could ban contributions if people want to spend their money to talk about candidates. Those are independent expenditures. But the question about publicly financing, it would open the process up to so many more Oregonians. We're seeing this play out right now in the Portland City Council races, where they have a system by which you can have public funding if you have matching funds at a certain level. You're seeing this incredible array of candidates, not candidates who are independently wealthy, who are basically running for office as something they do now that they're retired from a full career. You have young people, housing activists, people of color, an incredibly diverse group of folks running for the Portland City Council in that open seat. And so I'm very excited about the possibility of that. And I would love, as a candidate, my first time I ran for the Oregon House, it took me 6 months of 15 to 20 hours a week of call time and over 300 contributors to raise my first $30,000. As somebody who did not come from a wealthy background, I know that it's incredibly challenging for new candidates to even see themselves the possibility of running for office, because the possibility of raising money is so incredibly daunting. So I not only would support, I very am enthusiastic about public financing of elections. There has to be sideboards, of course, to make sure that we don't have people, running for office just to then put money into consulting businesses owned by families and friends and all the different issues that you have that are concerned about. But I think fundamentally, I would be very supportive of a strong, secure, and well-intentioned public financing system.
That next goes to Mark.
I support getting big money out of politics, and I've been working on that for years, and it's finally going to happen, I think, this year with the passage of the November ballot measure, which changes our Constitution. I was the chief sponsor of that measure, and I'm crossing my fingers now, campaign hard to make sure that passes. Right now in Oregon, we don't have enough money for education. We don't have enough money for college. Tuition keeps going up. We have a huge homelessness problem in Portland and across this state. And we can't provide subsidies for affordable housing. We can't help the homeless. The idea of now saying we have money to help candidates run for office just seems preposterous to me. I think in theory, it's a good idea, but the reality with the other budget priorities we have, from giving people a place to live, to helping them educate themselves, to giving them opportunities to reach the middle class, I don't think this ranks in the top 5 or 10.
Jamie.
I think giving more people access to not just voting, but also running for office is critically important. Then it comes down to the question that Mark raised of resources and the issues that, some of the issues that Shemia is raising about the rubber hitting the road. And so there is, first of all, to the point that Mark raised, getting big money out of elections is the start. The second piece is, how do we provide the resources so more people can engage in elections? So one of the things that, the bottom line for raising money is people being able to get their message out and contact and connect with voters. But the key thing for raising money is to be able to connect with and get your message out to voters. So one of the things, when I was on the Santa Clara City Council, that was incorporated, it was a voluntary opt-in, because there's laws that, the free speech laws that prevent an absolute requirement of it. But there was a program we put in place that allowed people to opt in, and then the city, so essentially through public financing, if you maintained not just the contribution limits, but also an overall cap on how much you raised, if you committed to that, stuck with that, then the city played a role in helping to get your word out. So the word out to voters on your behalf. It was also an ethics pledge that you had to sign on to make that commitment, which is another thing that helps to promote good governance. So I think there are hybrid models out there that we can explore. If we had the resources, absolutely. But what are some of the creative ways that we can actually help to get these things done? Because it's not, there's not this magic golden pot of money that we can turn to, but at the same time, we have to find creative solutions. And things like we did in Santa Clara were a way that gave a lot of different communities, a lot of different individuals who were not financially wealthy, access to the process to be able to run for office and serve in office as well.
Shemia?
I think she kicked us off.
I was the first one to answer.
Oh, thank you, because I was getting confused with a lot other questions. Next question is a 30-second question, again from Facebook watchers. Would you explicitly call out Oregon legislators who are part of the American Legislative Exchange Council? And since Shemia was the first answer, that would go to Mark.
Well, you know, my MO in the legislature has been to work with other people. That's how you solve problems. I don't go down there and call people out and fight with people. I understand where I think the sentiment is in that question, and I certainly disagree with that organization and their policies, but that's not how you get things done. The Oregon Promise passed the Senate 28-1. Because I work with Republicans, I work with business people and labor leaders, and Republicans all saw that their young people in their timber communities needed opportunities too, and we worked together. And we got that bill passed, and we got the free full-day kindergarten passed too. And so some of my biggest accomplishments have come from working with the other side. And I think people, whether they're Democrats or Republicans nowadays, really crave people working together and not fighting with each other. So no, I'm not in the business of calling people out. I'm not in the business of picking fights. I'll fight when I need to, but I'm not going to start off with a fight, because that's not how you get things done at the state capitol.
Jamie?
I think there are plenty of opportunities for folks to learn more about candidates. If there is something that involved the engaging in elections or people's access to elections or to voting, if there were specific things involved in terms of audits, essentially in terms of the duties of the Secretary of State's office, I would absolutely identify and daylight things. If there was something that within that affiliation or association that someone was doing that was impacting the security and safety of Oregonians and was impacting the role of the Secretary of State, that is something worth calling out. But independently going out and calling out folks in terms of their different affiliations, there are opportunities for Oregonians to hear that through other systems, but I don't think that's the role of the Secretary of State.
Shemia?
So there's no love lost between me and ALEC, which is an organization that is funded by right-wing think tanks and tries to basically present model legislation to pass in states that's incredibly conservative and not in line with Oregon values. I would not, however, call out legislators. I think one of the most important roles of the Secretary of State is to restore trust and faith in our democratic institutions. If we have a Secretary of State that's out calling out individual legislators just for membership in an organization, I think it cuts against that trust. One thing I would make sure as Secretary of State is if legislators are actually interfering with the functions of democracy, I would then speak out. And I think one great example is the Republican walkouts from 2019 and 2020. I had a different approach inside my caucus than what we ultimately did. I felt like we were appeasing them too much. As a mom of a toddler, I felt like we were essentially rewarding the walkouts too many times, particularly back in May of 2015 when they walked out over the Student Success Act, gun violence prevention, and other important legislation. And so I think that it's important that the next Secretary of State does call out any legislators, Republicans or Democrats or anybody who interferes with the functions of our democracy. And so I would come as a Secretary of State with a legislative package to hold legislators who walk out and shut down our democracy accountable. And so I would talk about they don't get paid. when they go and they walk out and they shut down the Capitol, and they have a certain number of unexcused absences, they shouldn't be able to run for re-election. Just like regular working Oregonians, you don't get paid and they don't show up for work, and when they essentially walk off the job, they're not eligible for rehire. And so that is a place where if they actually interfere with the functions of democracy, that I would use the bully pulpit of the Secretary of State to address that, but not just for individual membership in organizations that I strongly disagree with, because the primary role of the Secretary of State in the public image is to make sure that we restore faith and independence in that office, and calling out legislators for membership in conservative organizations I don't think would serve that purpose.
Okay, we've come to the 2-minute close, and everyone's going to get 2 minutes, and we would hope that part of what you would be saying is why you think you're the most qualified for Secretary of State. And we will start with Jamie.
Sure. So Oregonians across our state in urban and rural areas are not feeling heard. Oregonians are also really frustrated with the dysfunctional politics going on in the legislature right now, in Salem and the Capitol right now. It's something that there's a sense that we're not able to work together. We're not able to move forward. We need more results and less fighting. We've been embarrassed by the national news recently. And we also, it's not the model. It's like on a soccer team. You want to point out the team, then be able to show your kids that's how you play the game. That's not how politics is being done in the Capitol right now. Last year, Oregonians asked me to run based on my values and my ethics: transparency, collaboration, accountability, bringing Oregonians together. In 2018, I showed how a Democrat can build common ground throughout Oregon, including rural Oregon. We had the biggest change in the nation in any congressional race, and got 15% of non-Democrats, brought people together, won a county that a Democrat hadn't won in almost 50 years. That's what we do. We bring folks together. It's being accountable to people and not corporations. And I'm the only one in this race not taking corporate money, signed the fossil fuel pledge, and not taking from big pharma either. I'm the exception in the race on that. This role, Secretary of State, is essentially an executive leadership role, overseeing over 200 staff, and then also these different divisions, bringing and building accountability and public trust. I'm the only one in the race with actual government experience. Yes, I've got 9 years of policy experience, and that's important, but actually understanding how government runs is critically important. I commit to serving out the duties as Secretary of State if called to be the governor. You didn't ask us that question, but I've got the track record, including time in a former war zone in terms of deploying our National Guard troops. I would understand the role and be able to step into that executive leadership role as well. I began my public service by helping others, and I've stayed with it because I've been inspired by people who believe in this, and I've been inspired by the resiliency of folks. I speak up for folks, those voices are not heard, because that was my experience coming out as a young lesbian. This is my vision, and that's how I'll serve as your Secretary of State.
Thank you. Thank you. Shemia.
So I imagine a lot of folks watching this tonight might be like, man, I'm a Democrat and I like these 3 Democrats. I like what I see. It's hard to choose between them. And I understand that. I like my colleagues a lot, and I'd be happy to support any of them in the general election against the Republican candidate for Secretary of State. But there are a lot of organizations around the state that represent rural and urban folks, that represent suburban folks, communities of color all over this state, who actually interviewed all 3 candidates and also faced that same conundrum of, man, I like all 3 of these people. How do we choose? And those organizations that we trust during ballot measures and during elections against Republicans, they have lined up overwhelmingly behind me in this race. I'll just name off a few. I've endorsed in this race by Planned Parenthood and NARAL. The Oregon League of Conservation Voters has endorsed me. The Paccoon Latinx Farm Workers and Working Families Union, the Oregon Firefighters, the Oregon Education Association, as well as former Secretary of State and Governor Barbara Roberts. And they're endorsing me in this race, not because they dislike my colleagues, because as you can see, there's a lot to like in all 3 of us, but because what they see in me is a track record of standing up for progressive values, even when it meant standing up to my own party and my own friends. And I'll close in the words of the Ben Bulletin that endorsed me in this race. Unexpectedly, I'd never met anybody on the editorial board before, and I was very surprised by the endorsement, but they interviewed all of us, and they said they agree a lot on issues. They said, but we're endorsing Shemia Fagan because, quote, Shemia Fagan has a track record of being straight with Oregonians when things are not working as they should. And the Ben Bulletin recognized that, and I asked that Oregon voters would recognize that as well. And I'm asking for your vote in the Democratic primary on May 19th.
Mark?
Thank you. Well, we're in tough times right now, and tough times call for tough people who have been tested. and I believe I have been tested. This is a state agency that was created in the Oregon Constitution to oversee the most important functions of our state government: elections, accountability, redistricting, and these responsibilities were given to this office by Oregon pioneers when they established a new government to serve the settlers of Oregon. That is very important to me, and I don't take these duties lightly. Oregonians want someone who knows what they're doing. They don't want a newcomer. We have a newcomer in the White House, and that has not been ideal. They want someone familiar with the tools and the authority of this office, especially in a time like this. The proposals I've made for election security and increasing voter participation have won over some people who are helping me. Previous Secretary of State, Bill Bradbury, who was very popular and very effective Secretary of State, is on my campaign team, and he's endorsed me and he's helping me. Phil Kiesling, the father of Vote by Mail, has joined my campaign team. He's endorsed me and he's helping me. I do have labor support. The Teamsters are on my side, and if there's any organization that stands for working people, it's the Teamsters. I guess my point is that we need to work together in the coming months and years like we never have. We need to rebuild our economy and get people back to work. I've seen what happens when people work together in just my neighborhood over the past few weeks. You probably have too in your neighborhood. People donating food and money. A young girl on my street has volunteered to take dogs out for walks. This is really an important time. Quite literally, lives are at stake. I hope you agree with me that we need people we know and people we can trust. My record is solid. I'm proud of my accomplishments at the Capitol over the last 18 years. Big ideas are easier to achieve when people work together in good faith. The Student Success Act, the Oregon Promise, full-day kindergarten, these are not talking points. These are accomplishments. These are state laws. These are the results of listening to others, working with them, and getting the job done. I believe I have the independence to do this job and the integrity to do it right.
Thank you. And thanks all candidates, Jamie McLeod-Skinner, Shemia Fagan, and Mark Cass. We have a little bit of a reminder to people to close out the evening. I didn't share. Cancel. I'm trying to share a reminder that you need to vote. Make sure that you're registered to vote. Well, that won't work. So you can go to OregonVotes.org and do that. If you're registering and you have to fill out a form because you do not have a driver's license or an Oregon ID card from the motor vehicles, then you would need to make sure that you mail that to your county clerk's office. In Marion County, the county clerk will stay open, or will come down and pick it up if you call them prior to taking your ballot in, if it's on Friday, Monday, or Tuesday before the deadline, which is the 28th of April. You can also find more information about these candidates and other candidates at the League of Women Voters Vote 411, and it's real simple, very simple website. Thanks all for joining us, and again, thanks